History of the Wild West documentary. The Wild West wasn't just guns and gold, it was full of secrets, betrayals, and vanishing legends. Across 5 gripping chapters, we'll uncover the truth behind the myth. We'll see the full story. We have included little-known facts like, why did native leader Geronimo ride in a US president's parade after years of resisting the army? Or how did a woman sharpshooter become one of the biggest stars of the frontier, shooting every man around? Stick around, we'll reveal both as we ride through the real frontier. Part 1. Early Frontier and Exploration, 1800–1848. The story of the American West begins not with cowboys or gunfights, but with a signature on a treaty. In 1803, the United States made a land deal with France known as the Louisiana Purchase. For $15 million, the US acquired a vast expanse of territory, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, over 800,000 square miles of largely uncharted land. This acquisition more than doubled the size of the young republic and presented a new challenge: to explore, map, and understand what lay beyond the established states. President Thomas Jefferson, envisioning westward expansion, commissioned an expedition to investigate this immense frontier. In May 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set out from St. Louis with the cause of discovery, a group of about 45 men tasked with reaching the Pacific Ocean and documenting the route, the land, and the people along the way. Their path followed the Missouri River northwest through present-day Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. In the fall of 1804, they established Fort Mandan near present-day Washburn, North Dakota, where they wintered with the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes. These native nations were critical early allies, offering food, guidance, and trade. In the spring of 1805, a key figure joined the expedition: Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who had been captured as a child and was living among the Hidatsa. She, her French-Canadian husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, and their infant son accompanied the expedition westward. Her role as translator and guide proved vital, especially when the Corps encountered the Shoshone in the Rockies. Her presence not only secured horses and safe passage, but also signaled peaceful intent to wary tribal leaders. Interestingly, Sacagawea gave birth just before the journey began. Her son, Jean-Baptiste, traveled the entire trip in a cradleboard strapped to her back. As the Corps of Discovery crossed into what is now Montana, they encountered the rugged Bitterroot Mountains and the Continental Divide. Here, the expedition faced its most physically demanding challenges: freezing temperatures, snow-choked trails, and dwindling supplies. Despite this, they pushed onward, reaching the Columbia River basin, and in November 1805, finally arrived at the Pacific Ocean near modern-day Astoria, Oregon. They built Fort Clatsop for the winter, battling rain, illness, and scarcity of food, before beginning the return journey in March 1806. The expedition returned to St. Louis in September 1806, having traveled over 8,000 miles. Along the way, they charted detailed maps, recorded descriptions of over 120 previously unknown animals and plants, and made contact with more than 70 native tribes. Their findings were published and widely circulated, igniting national interest in westward expansion. But the expedition was not without peril. Only one member, Sergeant Charles Floyd, died, likely from a ruptured appendix. Lewis himself was accidentally shot in the thigh by a fellow hunter. And the team endured a winter at Fort Clatsop that was so cold and wet, it nearly ended the mission. In one notable moment, Lewis's beloved dog, Seaman, was kidnapped by a native tribe, but was later ransomed back. The dog had accompanied him the entire journey, serving as a hunting partner and guard. The legacy of Lewis and Clark was not just in their discoveries, but in the routes they established. Their maps and journals became essential tools for the next wave of frontiersmen, the POW mountain men. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, these independent fur trappers and traders began pushing deeper into the Rocky Mountains, seeking beaver pelts for the booming hat trade in Europe. Men like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and Hugh Glass blazed trails that would become arteries of westward migration. Bridger, who began as a fur trapper at 18, went on to guide settlers, and found Fort Bridger in modern-day Wyoming, a key stop along the Oregon Trail. Jedediah Smith was the first American to reach California overland from the east. Hugh Glass, a trapper with the Ashley Henry Company, became a legend after surviving a grizzly bear attack and crawling over 200 miles to safety, an ordeal that would later inspire novels and films. These mountain men lived and traveled through an expansive range, from the high peaks of Colorado and Montana to the dense forests of Idaho and Oregon. The fur trade routes they carved through the Rockies and across the Great Plains laid the groundwork for what would become the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails. At the same time, river hubs like St. Louis and later Independence, Missouri, grew into vital frontier cities. St. Louis in particular served as the gateway to the West, where expeditions were outfitted, traders exchanged goods, and settlers began their journeys. Forts and trading posts emerged across the frontier, often built by private companies or established through military effort to protect interests and trade routes. The geography of the West heavily influenced its exploration. The Missouri River acted as the main artery of movement in the early years. Beyond it, the Great Plains stretched with little natural shelter. Farther west, the Rocky Mountains presented a wall of stone, snow, and altitude. The Columbia River, meanwhile, offered a crucial route to the Pacific, but was plagued with rapids and treacherous cliffs. The varied terrain, plains, mountains, forests, and rivers, demanded adaptability and resilience from all who ventured there. This era also brought early conflicts and negotiations with Native American nations. While many early encounters involved trade and diplomacy, tensions began to grow as more trappers and settlers entered tribal lands. Initial peaceful interactions during the Lewis and Clark expedition gradually gave way to competition, mistrust, and, in some cases, violence. By the 1840s, spurred by the promise of farmland, gold, and a better life, settlers began moving west in increasing numbers. The trails first carved by explorers and trappers became highways of migration. The Oregon Trail saw tens of thousands of families cross the continent. It was the beginning of a new phase in the frontier story, one where exploration gave way to colonization. In just under 5 decades, the vast, mysterious West had transformed from a blank space on the map into a contested, mapped, and mythologized frontier. The early frontier and exploration period, stretching from 1800 to 1848, set the stage for everything that would follow: the gold rush, the Indian Wars, the rise of cowboys, and the lawless towns that would make the Wild West legend. Part 2. Westward Expansion and Conflict, 1849–1865. By the mid-19th century, the map of America was beginning to take shape, but much of the West remained unsettled, by Americans, that is. Native tribes, from the Sioux of the northern plains to the Apache of the Southwest, had lived across this vast land for centuries. Yet a new force was about to shift everything: gold. In 1848, just days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California. News of the find spread slowly at first, but by 1849 it triggered one of the greatest migrations in American history: the California Gold Rush. That year alone, an estimated 80,000 people, known as 49ers, streamed into California. By land and sea, hoping to strike it rich, the overland journey was grueling. Many traveled the California Trail, branching off from the Oregon Trail in what's now Idaho, and cutting across the arid deserts and high mountains of Nevada. Supplies were scarce, rivers had to be forded, and diseases like cholera claimed thousands. Whole wagon trains vanished in dust or snow. One of the most infamous tragedies was the Donner Party in 1846–47, who became trapped in the Sierra Nevada and resorted to cannibalism to survive. Geographically, this era was defined by major movement across the Great Plains, Rocky Mountains, and the Sierra Nevada. Key routes included the Santa Fe Trail, linking Missouri with New Mexico, the Mormon Trail, used by Latter-day Saints migrating to Utah, and the aforementioned Oregon and California trails. River towns like Independence, Missouri, and Council, Bluffs, Iowa, became the starting lines of westward travel. Meanwhile, the US government encouraged settlement through laws like the Preemption Act of 1841, which allowed squatters to buy public land cheaply. But while settlers saw opportunity, Native American tribes saw invasion. The clash was inevitable. As thousands poured westward, tensions escalated. The US Army established forts across the plains to protect wagon trains and assert federal presence. Fort Laramie in Wyoming and Fort Kearny in Nebraska became key military outposts. Treaties were signed, often under pressure or deceit, granting safe passage through tribal lands. But those treaties rarely held. In 1851, the First Fort Laramie Treaty attempted to set territorial boundaries for plains tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho in exchange for annual goods and supplies. But as more settlers arrived and railroads expanded, the agreement unraveled. Some tribes resisted peacefully, others fought back. One of the most notable uprisings of this era was the Dakota War of 1862. In Minnesota, promises of food and payments to the Dakota Sioux went unmet. Starving and desperate, Dakota warriors attacked settlements, killing hundreds. The US Army responded with overwhelming force, and after brief but brutal fighting, 38 Dakota men were hanged, the largest mass execution in US history. While these conflicts raged in the West, the nation was tearing itself apart in the East. The Civil War, 1861-1865, overshadowed frontier affairs for a time, but the West still played a role. California remained in the Union, and gold from Western mines helped finance the war effort. The war also provided new opportunities for settlers to move into territories left underdefended due to troop deployments elsewhere. Railroads began laying the groundwork for even more sweeping changes. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862, signed by President Lincoln, authorized construction of the first transcontinental railroad. This would eventually connect Omaha, Nebraska, to Sacramento, California, transforming the landscape of migration and commerce. The Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads would become the twin engines of frontier transformation. During this time, the US also began transitioning its native policy from negotiation to forced relocation. The idea of Indian Territory, lands in present-day Oklahoma, where tribes were to be resettled, took clearer shape. Many tribes were pressured into ceding ancestral lands, sometimes by force, sometimes through unfair treaties signed under duress. Meanwhile, communities sprang up, almost overnight. Mining camps became towns. Some, like San Francisco, flourished. Others became ghost towns within a decade. The lure of gold also spread beyond California. By the late 1850s, new strikes in Colorado, the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, and Nevada, the Comstock Lode, pulled prospectors deeper into the mountains. A curious fact from this era: in Virginia City, Nevada, the Comstock Lode produced so much silver that some of it was said to have spilled over in the streets. Mark Twain, working as a reporter in the city, later turned these stories into frontier folklore. Another tale: some enterprising merchants in mining towns made far more money selling picks, pans, and shovels than the miners ever did from gold. Culturally, the West was becoming a patchwork of languages and traditions. Spanish-speaking settlers in New Mexico, Chinese laborers in California, Mormon pioneers in Utah, and freed Black Americans seeking new starts all carved out communities. But tension was never far behind. Discrimination, displacement, and violence were part of the reality, beneath the dream of frontier freedom. By 1865, the Civil War ended, but the West was far from settled. The US turned its attention back to full-scale expansion, and with it came an escalation of conflicts with native nations, new waves of settlers, and the march of the railroad across the heart of the continent. This period, from 1849 to 1865, reshaped the geography and politics of the American West. Trails turned into highways of migration, temporary camps became towns, and dreams of fortune gave rise to deep conflict. It was a time of enormous movement, of people, ideas, and power, and it set the stage for the even more dramatic decades to follow. Part 3. Lawlessness and Legend, 1866-1880. With the Civil War concluded in 1865, the United States turned its full attention westward. The Reconstruction South struggled under military occupation, but the western frontier, wide and restless, beckoned veterans, freedmen, immigrants, and adventurers. The result was a sudden surge of migration, settlement, and violence that would define the next chapter in the story of the American West. Geographically, this period saw intensive activity across the Great Plains, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, territories the Dakotas, Montana, and the newly admitted state of Nevada. The expansion west was facilitated by the ongoing construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah. The railroad connected the eastern United States with California, dramatically shortening travel time and opening the floodgates to mass migration, trade, and government control. But with opportunity came chaos. Settlers flooded territories where law enforcement was thin or non-existent. Mining towns like Deadwood in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, cattle hubs like Abilene in Kansas, and border settlements like Tombstone in Arizona sprang up quickly, often with more saloons than churches, more gunmen than sheriffs. This was the age when the gunslinger, lawman, and outlaw emerged as iconic frontier figures. Jesse James, a former Confederate guerrilla, became one of the most notorious outlaws of the era. Alongside his brother Frank and the younger gang, Jesse robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches throughout Missouri, Kentucky, and Minnesota. Some viewed him as a Robin Hood figure, a rebel striking back at Northern authority. In truth, his robberies were brutal and self-serving. His legend grew even after his death in 1882, when he was betrayed and shot by a member of his own gang. In the Southwest, Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarty, earned his fame during the Lincoln County War in New Mexico. He claimed to have killed 21 men, one for every year of his life, though the real number was likely lower. Still, his boyish face, lightning-quick draw, and daring escapes from jail made him a media sensation. He was finally killed in 1881 by Sheriff Pat Garrett, a former acquaintance turned pursuer. The frontier also gave rise to legendary lawmen like Wyatt Earp, who served as a deputy marshal in Dodge City and later became a key figure in Tombstone, Arizona. His involvement in the gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881, alongside his brothers and Doc Holliday, solidified his place in Western law. That shootout, which lasted less than 30 seconds, became one of the most mythologized events in American history. Wild Bill Hickok, another gunslinger and lawman, patrolled towns like Hays and Abilene, Kansas. Known for his calm demeanor and deadly aim, Hickok was also an actor and gambler. He met a fittingly dramatic end in 1876 in Deadwood, shot in the back while playing poker. The hand he held, aces and eights, became known as the dead man's hand. Curious detail, many towns held cowboy contests, early precursors to the modern rodeo, where riders competed in roping and bronco breaking. Prize money was small, but reputation was everything. A victory in Dodge City could earn a cowboy work on a big cattle drive or make him a target. Speaking of cattle, this was the era of the great cattle drives. After the Civil War, Texas had over 5 million head of cattle but few markets. Enter the Chisholm Trail, which stretched from southern Texas to Kansas railheads like Dodge City, Wichita, and Abilene. Cowboys, often black, Mexican, or Native American, drove herds hundreds of miles north to meet the rails. It was dangerous, dusty work. Stampedes, river crossings, and rustlers were constant threats. The cowboys' gear, Stetson hat, bandana, spurs, and six-shooter, became visual shorthand for the entire West. But the real work was long hours, low pay, and rough sleeping under the stars. Meanwhile, Native American resistance flared once again. The Great Sioux War began in 1876, triggered by U.S. encroachment into the Black Hills after the discovery of gold. The most famous battle, Little Bighorn, saw the defeat of General George Custer by a coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. The U.S. government soon retaliated, and by 1877, much of the organized native resistance was crushed or confined to reservations. Frontier towns often sprang up overnight and collapsed just as quickly. Boom towns, fueled by mining, cattle, or railroads, were marked by gambling halls, brothels, and gunfights. In Tombstone, Deadwood, Virginia City, and Leadville, fortunes were won and lost in a single night. But without stable governance, violence was routine. Feuds over land, women, money, or pride often ended with bloodshed. Law enforcement was often ad hoc. Marshals were appointed by towns or hired by railroads and mining companies. Some lawmen were barely more honest than the criminals they chased. This blurred line between justice and survival gave rise to the enduring myth of the Western anti-hero. This era also birthed traveling performers like Buffalo Bill Cody, who took real frontier exploits and turned them into stage entertainment. His Wild West show, launched in 1883, featured reenactments of Indian battles, cowboy skills, and sharpshooting acts by legends like Annie Oakley. Though this fell outside our date range slightly, Cody's persona was forged in the 1860s-70s as a scout and buffalo hunter, and his storytelling helped shape how the East, and eventually the world, imagined the Wild West. By 1880, the West was no longer a blank canvas. Territories had boundaries, railroads had timetables, and federal marshals had more authority. But it remained a volatile place where myth and reality collided, and where the most enduring symbols of American grit, cowboys, outlaws, lawmen, emerged. This was the golden age of the Western legend, a time of bold characters, rough justice, and law forged at the barrel of a gun. Part 4. Settlement and Showmanship, 1881-1895. By 1881, the Wild West was changing. The great cattle drives were waning, Indian resistance had largely been subdued, and the Transcontinental Railroad was in full operation. What had been wild was slowly becoming settled. But while law and order crept in, the American imagination kept the myth of the frontier alive, through spectacle, showmanship, and storytelling. This was the era when the West became a stage. Across the map, the U.S. was knitting together its newest territories. The Dakotas, Montana, and Washington gained statehood in 1889. Idaho and Wyoming followed in 1890. Oklahoma was open to settlers in the land run of 1889, where tens of thousands raced to claim plots in what had once been Indian territory. It was a symbolic turning point. What had been called the frontier was now being divided, fenced, and owned. Meanwhile, towns that once echoed with gunfire were now installing telegraph wires, post offices, and train stations. Tombstone, Arizona, where the famed gunfight at the OK Corral had taken place just a year earlier in 1881, was transitioning from a mining boom town into a legal, structured municipality. Other towns like Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Denver, Colorado, evolved from frontier outposts into state capitals and regional hubs. Still, the frontier spirit hadn't died. It had just shifted into new arenas. One of the most transformative figures of this period was William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. Born in Iowa and raised in Kansas, Cody had worked as a Pony Express rider, buffalo hunter, and Army Scout. But starting in 1883, he launched a new kind of frontier legacy, the Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. Touring the US and Europe, the show reenacted stagecoach robberies, Indian battles, and cattle roundups. It featured live buffalo trick riders and sharpshooters, most famously Annie Oakley, a woman with unmatched aim and style. Cody's show turned real history into theater. Figures like Sitting Bull, the Lakota chief who had helped defeat Custer at Little Bighorn, joined the show briefly, introducing audiences to native perspectives, even if heavily romanticized. The show was part entertainment, part propaganda, blending fact and myth into a digestible, heroic story of American expansion. Reality, however, Native Americans were facing one of the harshest periods of their history, confined to reservations, stripped of their traditional ways of life, and subjected to forced assimilation through boarding schools and the outlawing of cultural practices. Many tribes were struggling to survive, not just physically, but culturally. One of the final flashpoints was the ghost dance movement, a spiritual revival among plains tribes, especially the Lakota, that promised the return of buffalo and the vanishing of white settlers. It frightened US authorities, leading to a tragic confrontation at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota in 1890. There, U.S. troops killed more than 250 Lakota, men, women, and children, in what is now considered one of the last major massacres of the Indian Wars. It marked a symbolic end to native resistance on the plains. Back in the settlements, life was changing rapidly. The barbed wire fence, patented in the 1870s, became widespread by the 1880s. This simple invention ended the era of open-range cattle ranching. Farmers and ranchers fought over land access in conflicts like the Johnson County War in Wyoming, 1892, where hired gunmen clashed with small ranchers over fencing and grazing rights. Railroads crisscrossed the West, bringing goods, mail, and migration at unprecedented speed. The economic center of gravity shifted from the saloon to the stockyard, from the mining pan to the dry goods store. The wild part of the West was vanishing, but not in memory. Curious fact, during this period, cowboy life was heavily mythologized. In dime novels, writers like Ned Buntline created larger-than-life versions of real people, including Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, even if their actual lives had little resemblance to the stories. These novels often sold for 10 cents and circulated widely in the East, helping create a national fascination with the Western frontier. Another curiosity, cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene, once infamous for lawlessness, began branding themselves as family-friendly communities, cleaning up their reputations to attract settlers and investment. Local lawmen sometimes hired theater companies or organized parades to change public perception. Meanwhile, sharpshooter Annie Oakley, born Phoebe Ann Mosey, was becoming a household name. She wowed audiences by shooting glass balls out of the air, lighting matches with bullets, and splitting playing cards on edge, all while maintaining a ladylike persona that challenged gender norms. Oakley's fame rivaled that of any male performer, and she became a symbol of female frontier independence. As the 19th century drew to a close, the U.S. Census Bureau declared in 1890 that the frontier line, the boundary between settled and unsettled land, no longer existed. This official statement marked the end of an era in the eyes of many Americans. But in the minds of audiences watching Buffalo Bill's show or reading dime novels by lamplight, the West was alive and well. This period, from 1881 to 1895, was one of transition, from raw frontier to settled statehood, from lived reality to legendary performance. It was the moment when the West stopped being just a place and became an idea, one filled with cowboys, shootouts, showdowns, and larger-than-life figures that would echo through American culture for generations. Part 5. The Closing Frontier, 1896-1910. By the mid-1890s, the American West had changed beyond recognition. What once was a land of endless promise and peril was now parceled into farms, towns, and states. Railroads reached nearly every corner. Telegraph lines carried instant communication, and lawmen no longer wore tin stars as symbols of desperation, but as part of formal state institutions. Yet, the West's transformation wasn't an end so much as a redefinition, one where the old legends gave way to a modern nation, and the frontier spirit became a national myth. The most symbolic moment of this transformation came in 1890, when the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the American frontier, as a distinct line between settled and unsettled land, no longer existed. Though this announcement predated our era slightly, its implications shaped everything that followed. The idea of the frontier began to fade in reality and flourish in culture. Still, the closing years of the 19th century were not entirely peaceful. In 1898, the U.S. went to war with Spain and acquired territories like the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Veterans of the Frontier Army and Western Scouts, including Buffalo Bill, framed this as a continuation of American expansion. The Wild West became an exportable idea, a model of rugged heroism and conquest. In the heart of the West, however, the transformation was more mundane and practical. Territories like Utah, 1896, Oklahoma, 1907, New Mexico, and Arizona moved steadily toward statehood. Land previously held as reservations or federal property was opened to settlers through policies like the Dawes Act, 1887, which aimed to break up tribal lands and assimilate Native Americans into individual land ownership. The Oklahoma Land runs, particularly in 1893 and again in 1895, saw tens of thousands of settlers charge into previously restricted native lands to claim homesteads. Boomtowns sprang up overnight, some prospering, many failing. Native communities were displaced again and again, and while some adapted, others were pushed to the margins, economically and culturally. Geographically, the last frontiers included remote areas of the Dakotas, Montana, Arizona, and New Mexico, where ranching, mining, and agriculture expanded rapidly. Copper mines in Bisbee, silver veins in Tombstone, and coal in Wyoming drew immigrants from Italy, China, and Eastern Europe, diversifying the once predominantly Anglo frontier. Cattle drives gave way to fenced ranches and refrigerated railcars, which made local meatpacking obsolete. The open range was gone, replaced by ownership titles, barbed wire, and legal disputes. Cowboys, once the nomadic workers of cattle barons, became hired ranch hands, still riding but with fewer stories to tell. Culturally, the West was entering the age of nostalgia. Figures like Wyatt Earp, who lived into the 1920s, watched their youthful exploits turned into dime novels, stage plays, and later silent films. Earp even consulted on early westerns in Hollywood, offering advice on how to draw a gun or wear a holster. His old friend and adversary Bat Masterson became a sports writer in New York, reflecting on a past that already felt like legend. Curious fact: in 1901, the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, featured a recreation of a western town with staged shootouts and cowboy parades. It was there that President McKinley was assassinated, an event overshadowing the very frontier fantasy on display. One of the most enduring icons of this final era was Geronimo, the famed Apache leader who surrendered in 1886 but lived until 1909. In a twist of history, he participated in public events like Theodore Roosevelt's 1905 inaugural parade, dressed in traditional Apache garb and riding horseback. Though treated as a curiosity by white audiences, Geronimo's presence was a silent reminder of a history far more complex than Wild West shows ever portrayed. Meanwhile, the legacy of Native American resistance lived on in quieter forms: storytelling, spiritual preservation, and the legal battles for land and recognition that would carry into the 20th century. Technology continued to press in. The automobile made its first appearance on frontier roads. Towns like Denver, Phoenix, and Salt Lake City were installing electric streetlights and telephones. The western wilderness, once navigated by wagon, was now accessible by train and, soon, by car. By 1910, the West had not only been settled, it had been modernized. Yet even as the Wild West faded into the rearview mirror of progress, its myths grew stronger. Writers like Owen Wister, with his 1902 novel The Virginian, and painters like Frederick Remington, with scenes of galloping horsemen and desert sunsets, cemented the image of the West as a place of rugged individualism and noble conflict. This final chapter, spanning 1896 to 1910, marked the close of the frontier as a physical reality, but the beginning of its afterlife as legend. The dust settled, the guns quieted, and the cattle trails turned to pavement. What remained was the story, retold across generations of lawmen and outlaws, settlers and warriors, fortune seekers and showmen. The Wild West had ridden into history, but its echoes would never fade. No way, partner. This tale ain't over yet. Click the video to uncover intriguing, little-known stories from the Old West, secret duels, vanishing outlaws, and legends too wild for the history books. You won't believe what we dug up.